Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Learn and Grow series, the educational component of the Williamsburg Botanical Gardens mission. My name is Judith Alberts, and I serve on the board of directors at the garden. A bit of housekeeping for today. I always do this. I always forget to click on the application, and now it will advance. Yes, we are recording this session. And if all goes well, you'll see the replay link in about 48 hours. And if it's not too horrible, we'll post it publicly on the YouTube channel. Please make sure that you're muted, and we'll be using the chat box for questions, and our speaker will answer them at the end. And bear with us if we run into any technical glitches. I see from the names in the participants pane that many of you know Williamsburg Botanical Garden. You know us well. You've been either working in it or have visited many times, and you've been to our programs at the Interpretive Center. But for anyone who is new, the first thing to know about us is that we are free to visit, and we're open every day from 7 a.m. until dusk. The garden is really quite small. It's only 2 acres in what is actually a traffic circle in the road on the way to the Freedom Park parking lot. But there's a lot that fits in those 2 acres. There are over 18 different types of habitat, such as a wildflower meadow, woodlands, 3 different types of wetlands, a succulents rock garden, an iris garden, a calcareous ravine, to name just a few. Our garden is intentionally more natural than what you might expect from the words botanical garden. It is not a highly manicured display of high maintenance plantings. I like calling it a wild child. We have a strong emphasis on native plants that support pollinators, and it is officially registered as Monarch Butterfly Way Station number 3394. Now, this has been an outstanding year in the garden, despite our challenges with volunteers and COVID-19. But many of our frequent visitors and members have commented that they've never seen the garden looking better. The garden's mission is to demonstrate environmentally responsible and sustainable gardening practices and to give education on related topics. Everything in the garden is tended by our dedicated volunteers, and we do it on a very slim budget. And here comes the pitch. The garden is a 501c3 nonprofit corporation. We receive no funding from any government agency. That's our website. Our Learn and Grow programs are free, and under normal circumstances, we would have a donations jar at the registration table. Historically, Learn and Grow programs have been a steady revenue stream for the garden. COVID-19 has certainly impacted that. Follow-up email to today's recording link will, of course, include a handy link to this virtual donations jar. We encourage you to support the garden through a membership. If you order bulbs from Brent and Becky's in Gloucester, they donate a very generous 25% of the order total to nonprofits that are enrolled in their program when you start your order at bloominbucks.com. And if you shop on Amazon, as many of us are doing these past many months, and we're probably going to do some more serious shopping as the holidays approach, please start at smile.amazon.com so that a portion of your purchase will support the garden or any other nonprofit of your choice. Now, I am happy to say that we now have 11 supporters. Thank you, whoever you are, because Amazon does not share your information with us. The only thing that we know is that we have 11 supporters now, which is up from 8 about a month ago, and our October orders doubled over September's. So please start at smile.amazon.com. You'll also find the garden on Facebook and YouTube. And if you are a Monarch Crusader, please join us on the Facebook group WBG milkweed connection. Learn and Grow programming will remain virtual until further notice. So please watch your inbox for programs coming next year. And last item before I introduce today's speaker, Master Gardeners and Master Naturalists may count this as continuing education units in the volunteer management system. So let's get started. Today's speaker is Brian Tabor, president of the Coastal Virginia Wildlife Observatory since 2002. The observatory celebrated its 26th anniversary this year. You'll find more information at cvwo.org, on their Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can follow all the links on their website. Brian has been involved in the garden for many years as our garden steward, and here's the monarch way station in the garden. Brian's a native of the Chicago area and came to Williamsburg to study at William and Mary. His professional career was in social services, but he has been highly interested in nature ever since he was a child. He is the author of Riding the Wind, a birder's ups and downs, available, of course, on the CVWO's website. And I hope that you will join me in welcoming Brian as he shares insights into how everything is connected. It'll take me just a moment, but Brian, I'm turning the microphone over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I guess they can hear me, huh? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Is that how you check the volume and everything? All right. Yeah, I want to thank you all for inviting me. This Learn and Grow series for the Botanical Garden is wonderful, and I congratulate you all on doing all this. Judith suggested the topic, which is actually a rather large one, including everything. So had to break that down into some smaller categories, and we couldn't get the slides to work on my laptop. So Judith is running the slideshow. You want to go ahead and put the first one up there for us? All right. I can see it. Can everybody see the slides that are there? All right. And I know this audience, even though we're talking about everything's connected, this audience is well aware that you guys are birders and butterfly people and gardeners, all that. So I know that you guys are it's a friendly audience for learning all this stuff, but we'll talk about some examples of how things are connected. All right, next slide. So these guys are connected. They're very different types of organisms, an amphibian and a butterfly, and there's plants, but they're connected. Next slide. And here's a butterfly eating and connected to some mammal droppings that are out on a trail. So that's the kind of connections we're talking about. Next slide. So to make it a little bit easier, the 5 parts that I broke this into were to talk about migration, climate change, eat and be eaten, where people and wildlife meet, and then things that we can do to promote good connections in our yards and around the world. And this is the organization that I've been a volunteer with since it began in 1994. Next slide. And that's our modified mask logo for 2020, which has been a challenging year for all of us, as you know. And I've also been a volunteer at the Botanical Garden since it began. I can't even remember what year that was, but it's been a long time, and I've been helping with the butterfly garden section in the middle there. All right, next slide. All right, so migration. Next slide. It's something that I've studied for decades, and I never get tired of it. It's endlessly fascinating, and it happens throughout the world, but it also happens right in everybody's yard and your gardens. Next slide. That's out in New Mexico, where there's hundreds of thousands of snow geese and sandhill cranes that come every year. Next slide. This is Iceland, and I was lucky enough to be able to go there a few years ago. Next slide. And here's a bird that actually lives there and also lives in Greenland, but can also make it all the way down to Virginia as a migrant, which is exciting for us, but it also just shows how they can travel the world. That's a northern wheat ear. Next slide. This is Alaska. I've also been lucky enough to travel to there. That's Denali, the mountain. Next slide. And that's a Lapland longspur, and they breed in Alaska, but they can travel all the way to Virginia, out in wild open fields. Next slide. And then I've also been lucky to travel around Arizona and New Mexico, Oregon in the west. There's a desert area. Next slide. And then here's a black-chinned hummingbird that can make it all the way from a desert area, migrating to Virginia, which, as you'll notice, is east, not south. So these birds can go in all directions, and they do. Next slide. We also have been studying shorebirds, and this is a book that we helped, the organization helped publish a few years ago when Claudia Wiles had done lots of surveys at CHINCOTEAGUE, but the notes were all in a box, and Ned Brinkley organized them all, and we put them into a book form and got that out to people who could benefit by the information and show that her work could be published. And it's a wonderful study of all the shorebirds that migrate through Virginia. Next slide. And there's some of the shorebirds that we see. We see lots of species of those. Next slide. This is an Arctic tern. They migrate in what's called probably the greatest migration there is, and they see perhaps more daylight than any other creature because they're in the north for the long summers, and then they go down south where the seasons are reversed, and they just follow the daylight. That's an incredible organism. Next slide. This is a Pacific golden plover. I was lucky to see those in Alaska, and a lot of these go across the Pacific Ocean when they migrate without stopping and go to Asia. Next slide. This is a yellow wagtail, and they actually migrate from Siberia to Alaska. So they're another east-west migrant crossing the ocean, which is an incredible journey for them. Next slide. These are a little closer to home. You guys have probably seen these at your feeders. This year has been a big year for pine siskins, and they breed in the northern US and in Canada. And in some years, their production is so high that, and I guess the food supplies can also be low, that they come south. And this is over at Kiptapeak, where I do a lot of study. And the feeders there have had about 200 siskins on them for most days over the last month. It's been truly amazing. Next year, it's likely that there will be almost none of them. That's the kind of cycle that they're on. So it's a fascinating migration pattern. Next slide. I guess you all know monarchs migrate, so it's not just birds. They're possibly the only butterfly in North America that we know that actually does migrate. Some butterflies will move north for a season. Some butterflies might move south for a season. But to truly migrate, you're going in both directions, and monarchs move north and then they come south, even though it's different generations that move south, and they winter in near Mexico City. And our organization actually tags them. Next slide. A lot of you are familiar with prothonotary warblers, and some of you help to monitor the sites that we have here. Our secretary for CBWO is Shirley Devan, who heads that program, and a number of you have been out in canoes with hers, checking boxes and nesting sites. It's one of our favorite birds to study. And peregrines, most people are familiar with peregrine falcons. Even if you don't know other birds, most people know that the fastest animal in the world is in a dive is a peregrine falcon, and their migrations go from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Next slide. You can't see it too well, but that's a whale breathing off of Virginia Beach, a humpback whale, and they migrate too. They follow the food sources and the temperatures and go in different places to have their offspring. Next slide. All right, climate change. Next slide. Everybody is talking about that. This is a glacier in Alaska. And unfortunately, these are receding. Pieces are breaking off regularly, and that causes sea level rise. Next slide. So a lot of the northern areas are melting, and birds are having to cope with what to do about that, and some of them just ride ice flows. This one happens to be on the James River during a very cold winter, but it's the same idea, and that really changes their lifestyle when their conditions change dramatically. Next slide. And of course, fossil fuels are driving a lot of the change. This was taken when I was up in Nome, and the gas prices up there were much higher because it's so tough to get deliveries up to a place that has few roads. Next slide. So what will it be like for musk oxes that have to live in different climates? We don't know exactly, but with that woolly coat on there, you can imagine that if it gets warm, that's not going to be the best conditions for them. Next slide. This is a willow ptarmigan, just a gorgeous bird of the north. And if conditions change too much for them, their tundra is going to be vastly different than it is today. Next slide. Purple finches, some of you probably have those at your feeder. They do some of the same things that pine siskins do. They come from Canada back and forth to United States. This year there are some around, as well as evening grosbeaks, which is a real treat. I remember seeing those in the 1980s and 90s and thought evening grosbeaks were great. And since then, I've hardly seen a one. And this year they are down for whatever reason, which is great for everybody to see. Next slide. Even sea otters have to deal with warming temperatures and their food sources. This was also in Alaska. Next slide. And of course, everybody's talking about how storms will change in the next few years. This is a water spout off of North Carolina, and we're going to see more and more storms. This year is the highest number, I think, of tropical storms for North America ever, and it's just expected to continue like that. Next slide. So with additional rainfall and storms, these are the kind of things we might see. I mentioned our prothonotary warbler nest box project. This is one of the ones that I monitor that's out on the Powhatan Trail near Jamestown. And it rained so much this spring that box that was several feet above the water got trashed when the rains continued for several days. It flooded it. There was not a nest in there at the time, thankfully. But we had to then repair the whole thing and get it ready for prothonotarians to use, which they did later on once the water level rose. But those are the kind of conditions that we're dealing with and that birds have to deal with. Next slide. There are some owls that live in the far north, and they have to deal with severe climate change. This is a northern saw-whet owl, the famous one that was found in the Rockefeller Christmas tree that made national news a few days ago. Next slide. And of course, everybody loves snowy owls, and they come down occasionally, but their prey, which is lemmings and snowshoe hares, and other mammals, that changes every time the conditions change, and the Arctic is changing faster than any place else in North America. So will they be able to handle all the changes? Next slide. All right, another way that we can talk about connections and everything being connected, of course, is to either eat or be eaten in this world. Next slide. And so we study hawks a whole lot, and here's two of them that aren't getting along at the moment. Not really going to eat each other, but they're competing for a lot of the same prey items. Next slide. And everybody probably knows that coyotes are moving into the areas, and they are recorded, I think, in all of Virginia counties. This one's down at Craney Island in Portsmouth, where we do our water bird studies, and they do eat ground nesting bird eggs. Next slide. Everybody loves grasshoppers in your garden. They eat our plants and then other birds and eat them. Next slide. Gigantic spider web, and they're experts at catching and eating everything that's out there. That's over on the eastern shore. This is a variegated fritillary caterpillar that's out at the Marina Garden that I've been managing near Jamestown. And they are, this one's eating the native plants, which is passion flower vine. Next slide. And then there's our friend, the monarch caterpillar, that eats milkweed, but is basically poisonous to anything that tries to eat it because of the poisons that are in the milkweed that it ingests. So it's got these bright colors on there that are supposedly a warning to animals, but can you go back one slide? There you go. That's got a lot of bright colors too, and that's supposedly a warning. So it's possible that this caterpillar has evolved a way of not being eaten because it does have bright colors, even though it's not distasteful. So they don't look all that different. That's orange and black. And then next slide. And you've got yellow and black and white. So the animals and birds that eat these things have got great eyesight, and they have to decide what to eat and what not to eat. Next slide. And there's a monarch, and we always hear about them not being eaten, both as adults and caterpillars, but that's a dragonfly that has caught a monarch and it's devouring it. So it happens. That's the only time I've actually seen a dragonfly eating a monarch. Next slide. And speaking of Shirley and the Prothonotary Trail, there's one down at Northwest River Park in Chesapeake, and the first time I went with her to help with the nest boxes, this cottonmouth came by. So those volunteers put up with a few extra little exciting moments down there. And of course, they're a great predator, and everyone knows that. Next slide. And even little guys like praying mantises have evolved this method of hunting everywhere. And here's one on a hummingbird feeder, because not only hummingbirds get attracted there, but bees, butterflies, and other insects come there. So this one is all perched and ready to pounce on an unsuspecting insect at the feeder. Next slide. This is an Arctic ground squirrel, also in Alaska, and they are really abundant, and they're just a wonderful prey item for all sorts of predators up there, birds and mammals, and they are one of the main food sources besides lemmings and voles. So they eat grasses, but they also get eaten by the millions. Next slide. And then, of course, as you're eating things, you don't really want to eat plastic and fishing line and all the other trash that we tend to see on the beach. But we know that's a big problem, and it's growing all the time. Next slide. This is the only slide that isn't mine, but I liked it because it's such a great picture of a merlin. This is at CHINCOTEAGUE too. And for all the birds that they catch and eat, which have lots of protein, here's one that loves to snack on dragonflies. And they get enough off of those to get energy. Next slide. And it's good that this one's a little bit out of focus because it's a little bit gory, but this is another merlin. And when I was at CHINCOTEAGUE just 2 weeks ago, it came near the bird feeder and caught a goldfinch, but then it landed right behind us on this pole and started eating away, and the feathers were flying as it was plucking it there. Next slide. And this is a variegated fritillary butterfly, and it's eating passionflower vine, the same thing you saw the caterpillar on. And you can just barely, I think, see a caterpillar on the other side of that leaf sticking out. Next slide. And then, of course, flycatchers will eat moths and butterflies. That's a great crested flycatcher. Eating the moth, getting ready to feed it actually to babies in a nest at my house. Next slide. This was out at College Creek. A lot of you have been out there. And of course, this was a pretty dramatic scene with a red tail that just happened to be catching a rabbit and holding him by the face as he flew off. So next slide. This is something that I have spent really decades involved with. And Ruth Beck, who was a professor at the College of William and Mary, who's passed away now, kind of introduced me to all of this because I was working on her team as a volunteer. And most of the places we worked were areas where we were trying to solve the problems of people and wildlife coming together. And of course, you all do that with your gardens. And the Botanical Garden does that very well all the time. Next slide. So down at Grandview Beach in Hampton, there's a wonderful place where birds nest. These are two American oyster catchers in the foreground. And a few days before that, there was nothing there except sand and these sandpipers. But on the weekends, since the city of Hampton won't close it off to recreational vehicles, this is what happens on the weekend. So they had started a nest there, and most likely their nest failed because you can see boats and those little jet skis, and they're bringing tents and umbrellas, and dogs run around and eat the eggs. And it's really a sad kind of sight because there's so many birds there, but all it takes is a few days of visitors by the dozens coming there, and it just disrupts the entire colony. So I hope that'll change one day. We're hopeful that it could. Next slide. This is another place that I spend a lot of time, which is Craney Island in Portsmouth. And the Army Corps of Engineers dredges from the left side there, which is the James River, and they dredge from the right side there, which is the Elizabeth River, and they pump all of the dredged spoil into that rectangle. And to give you a sense of the size, that's about 2 miles on each edge. So it's about a 4 square mile area, and it's just full of mud and water, and it attracts birds by the absolute millions. And of course, the Hampton Roads Bridge tunnel is just a little ways away, and then 1 million other people in the whole metropolitan area are right there. But it's a real haven for birds. And our waterbird team studies there because we try to help the Army Corps and its contractors manage so that they're not digging where birds are nesting. Next slide. So they build dikes and all kinds of structures there at Craney Island. Next slide. They have to move the water around because it's an endless cycle of sediment and rain and pumping and settling. But they have to be able to put the dirt somewhere because they have to keep the navigation lanes open for the boats. Next slide. There's a gull trying to get some nutrients out of some pumped in sludge. Next slide. They're also building on the east side of Craney Island some more land that eventually is supposed to become a port. They're increasing the size of the ships, and so they're increasing the size of the Panama Canal. So all these larger ships have to come somewhere, and Hampton Roads is trying to be able to accommodate all of those. So this new port will handle the giant ships coming up from the Pacific. Next slide. All right, my little friend there is telling me that it's halfway, so I'll ask Judith how we're doing on time.
We are good. It's only 10:32, and I haven't been able to check the chat box yet, but
Okay.
you're
Yeah,
good
you were
to
going to
go.
have questions and answers afterwards, I think.
I think that's best, yes.
Okay, all right. Well, keep going. Next slide. But despite all of the sludge and the building down there, it creates these areas that really look like wonderful natural areas. Some of the vegetation is Phragmites, which is invasive, but a lot of it is cattails and other growth. And there's these wonderful impoundments down there at Craney Island that are just wonderful for a variety of wildlife. This area is closed to the public because of all the construction that's there. Next slide. And some of the birds that we study there are least terns. These two are going through courtship, offering a fish in exchange for you know what. Next slide. Black-necked stilts. It's one of the 2 places in Virginia where they nest, and it's where most of them nest. And they're just a wonderful, elegant shorebird that we study. They migrate as well. Next slide. We've even found piping plovers that other people have banded, and I don't know if you can see too well, but there are color bands on the legs here. So when we find a bird like this, we know how to report that, and they can take our photo and look at the color bands and say, oh, we can figure out where that bird came from. And we have found tagged birds at Craney Island that were tagged or banded in Brazil. And we found them that this one I think came from Michigan, actually, piping plover. Next slide. And sometimes rarities will show up down there. We're not actually studying these because they only rarely show up, but roseate spoonbill, giant pink bird, a nice bonus for us. And speaking of where people and wildlife come together, this is the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, which is one of the busiest stretches of road anywhere. And you can see a common tern in the foreground there, flying. And just to the left, you can see huddled over there a black skimmer. And what you can't see in the picture is 2 or 3 baby birds just hatched. And these birds can run around soon after hatching, and they can go straight out into the traffic there. So it's a danger to the traffic. the danger to the birds. And there was a presentation the other day on Zoom for the Williamsburg Bird Club that talked about the work down there that Virginia Tech is doing. We have done a lot of bird surveys there too, but the idea is to find a way to keep the people and the birds separate down there, which is a tough job. We see dead birds all the time. There's just so much traffic and they're attracted to this dangerous spot. Next slide. So we help, and so do a lot of other organizations, with posting signs so that the contractors can know where they can work. Next slide. This is Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel 2. These are royal terns. I think we've counted 5,000 or 6,000 at a time there. And the noise is incredible, but they love that little patch. Next slide. And this is down in North Carolina, another example of people and animals, birds coming together. There were whales here around this fishing boat, and just thousands of gulls getting the food and the waste products from the fishing boat that was down there. So that's where people and wildlife come together. That's a wonderful thing to work on, and we can all do that because we all interact with them. We all have yards and gardens and everything. So now, what can we do to help promote positive connections among everything? Well, there's a lot. Next slide. We can go out and do butterfly surveys. I know you know a lot of these folks, and some of you might even be those folks. This is our, what we call the Creole Pearly-Eye survey team, which is out near Jamestown. It's a rare butterfly that we've been working on. Next slide. And you can go out and do bird surveys and do fundraising. You guys probably know some of these folks too, the Gulls Gone Wild, for the Kip to Peak Challenge event that not only does bird surveys, but raises money for Coastal Virginia Wildlife Observatory, which is a big thank you to those folks and the other teams that have participated in that for 25 years. Next slide. We can work with all kinds of partners. This is Emily Cope with the James River Association, and we gave her information about the Creole Pearly Eyes because they host school groups all the time out there. This is that little center that's off the Colonial Parkway near Jamestown, and they're doing kayaking and other educational activities with lots of school groups. So that's they're a great partner and friend. Next slide. We can keep our cats indoors. I had cats for years, and I didn't always have them indoors, but that's really where they belong. Estimates are that they can kill up to, like, I think a billion birds just in North America every year. So I love cats, but let's keep them indoors. Next slide. Plastics. I know a lot of you are aware of the kinds of problems we have with plastic bottles and the plastics that are in the oceans. That can on the right is pesticides, so we can all be careful with the kinds of pesticides that we use. Read all the warnings and labels and try to use what we can for our gardens to be the best for wildlife. And the window there is just to show that there are a lot of collisions also that happen with birds. And there are cities that are actually trying to change their lighting patterns and the way they build buildings just to prevent bird strikes, which are there's just millions and millions of those all the time. But be aware of that. You can put screens on your window so that if a bird hits a screen, it's a soft blow instead of a hard one on the glass. Next slide. You all probably know, I guess, about songbird coffee that's generally shade grown coffee. And you need to be aware, well, when you're buying that there's lots of different kinds of certification processes, and some of them aren't all that they're cracked up to be. So do your research on it and find out if it really is friendly practices and shade grown and organic, but it's a wonderful way to help birds if you can. When I was in Costa Rica, I got to visit a shade coffee plantation, and it was just remarkable. There was so much coffee growing there, and then all above it were all these canopy trees that were just filled with birds and butterflies, and it was just a great relationship. And I didn't get to go to a sun coffee plantation, but those are out in the open. There's no other birds around. It's a monoculture of one type of plant. It uses way too much water, too much fertilizer. So I would encourage everybody, if you can, to try to find different ways of finding bird-friendly and shade-grown coffee. Next slide. We can do other things like study butterflies. This is a butterfly biologist out catching monarchs to tag. Next slide. And there's one that got tagged. And if you all don't know that process, the University of Kansas provides tags that organizations can use to tag butterflies during fall migration when they're headed to Mexico. And some of the ones that we've tagged have shown up at the roost sites in Mexico City, which is pretty amazing. Next slide. We can go out and do surveys. This is part of the Craney Island survey team, counting sometimes thousands and thousands of birds in a day, and then telling the Army Corps of Engineers where they should try to do some of their work and where they can avoid doing some of their work. Next slide. And here's some friends of ours, Adrian and Gary, that probably a lot of you all know, up at the Dragon Run doing the Planetary Warbird Nest Box project up there. Next slide. Shirley, who I mentioned before, who not only monitors them like I do, but she also has the ability to band them. She's certified to be able to do that. So we can find out where they've gone. Next slide. These are some Eagle Scouts. We can do things like this. They are helping at the Marina Garden out at Jamestown. So they're helping their community, they're helping the environment, they're learning about conservation-minded approaches as they grow up, and it's just wonderful. They approached me with the garden out there about putting in pavers for the paths. So much nicer for people to walk around on the paving, and much less weeding for me to do than the mulch paths that were so good at growing weeds out there. Next slide. And they even helped build a couple of pollinator hotels. You guys probably know about those. There's many types of those things, but they help a lot of different kinds of insects, a lot of different kinds of solitary bees, just by having holes and various nooks and crannies for them to live in. Next slide. So there's some of the finished product. The garden has really done well out there the last 3 years. Provides a lot of food for birds and butterflies, and it's a concentration point for us to be able to study butterflies there. And we've seen most of the butterflies in the entire area have all been at that garden over the last 3 years. Next slide. So there's the garden. It's also a monarch way station. Judith mentioned that was the case for Botanical Garden too. Next slide. And we can do things like putting up kestrel, American kestrel nest boxes. This is one that was going up at Kiptopeak years ago. And the Virginia Society of Ornithology is doing a lot with that project, trying to get boxes up all over Western Virginia particularly, and helping that species. There are so many species that are in peril that they all need a lot of help. Next slide. And we can also do things like this. This is Dave Euchre, one of our volunteers, who's putting up an antenna and receiving station down at Craney Island. And so many researchers are putting electronic tags on bats and birds, and they also want to put them on dragonflies, if you can believe that. So in the future, there'll be more. And when those electronic tags go past a station like this antenna will record it, and it goes onto a little chip on a little computer. And then we can tell the researchers where their organisms went, what routes they were taking. So this is on top of a weir out at Craney Island. It's run by a solar panel and some antennas. And we actually purchased that with a special fund that we had through the organization that was dedicated to Ruth Beck after she passed away. Next slide. These are some of the folks that work out on the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, studying the birds that are there, including Virginia Department of Transportation personnel there. Next slide. And we can also do things like bird banding. This was over at the Eastern Shore Virginia National Wildlife Refuge. And banding is a very important way to learn things that you just can't learn from other visual surveys that you take. Next slide. We can also do a lot of education, all of our organizations. This is a butterfly brochure that we put out to try to encourage people to learn about butterflies and butterfly conservation. And we distributed this to all of the schools in 11 municipalities all over coastal Virginia last year. Next slide. And we can also do things like education. This is an educator telling kids about hawks over at Kiptopeke. Next slide. Same thing, another educator. You can see a finger pointing on the right-hand side there. Somebody's watching a hawk go by or something as she's talking, pointing out that, which is a lot of fun over there. Next slide. And then there's data, and all of us can help with gathering data, sharing data, and of course, data is not important. I mean, it's not helpful if it's not shared. So putting it in these gigantic databases that are being created over the last number of years is really important. And this is butterflies and moths of North America. And you can submit your observations in there, but you can also check on any locality in any state. And if people have put in lots of butterflies, you can see which species have been seen in any different locality. So it's a wonderful resource. Next slide. Another big resource is the North American Butterfly Association, or NABA. They're the ones that sponsor the counts, and a lot of you all, I'm sure, are participants in that count. Adrian has managed those around here for the last several years. North American Butterfly Monitoring Network is also different, which is another group of people that study trends and try to point out ways that they can, that conservation can help butterflies. These are a lot of more professional organizations with universities and other organizations. Next slide. And Monarch Joint Venture is the main partner for that. You can't see in the picture too well there, but that's part of the millions of the monarchs that are roosting down in Mexico City. But their organization tracks those and tracks the tags. Next slide. And a newer one is eButterfly, and they really improved their whole system this past spring. And I've been using it, and I know a lot of others locally here have too, and you can put in your observations there too. It keeps a list for you of what you've seen, but it also builds up the inventory of what's been seen all over North America, and even farther, I think, for this organization. So researchers and scientists and conservationists can all mine that data, because without it, you can't really tell what's going on. And it takes citizen scientists like volunteers like a lot of us to be able to build up those databases. Next slide. And I think everybody probably knows about eBird, which is similar to eButterfly. It's the same thing. Cornell University runs this site, and it's become just an immense resource for what's happening with all birds everywhere. Next slide. And the Hawk Watch that we do at CHINCOTEAGUE and the one that we do out at College Creek sends all of our data into this organization, which is the Hawk Migration Association of North America. And just like all those other databases, it's meant to show what's really going on in mathematical and scientific terms, so that it's not just somebody's opinion. And lawmakers and conservationists can use all that information to protect species. Next slide. And there's even one for saw-whet owls. This is Project OwlNet. Next slide. And we can go out to our local places and look for birds, look for hawks. This is out at College Creek, our volunteers. Next slide. And we can hire young people like this. These are recent grads who are biologists, and they do a fantastic job of trying to track hawks, butterflies, and other birds. And it gives them a great opportunity to learn all that too, as they're getting out of school and taking their educational studies out into the field, so they can see the real world out there. Next slide. And some of the people in here you guys might know too. I can't remember which group this is, but this is another group that's having fun at the Hawk Watch out there in the fall at CHINCOTEAGUE. Next slide. That's the Hawk Watch too. Next slide. And this is local. This is over the Powhatan Trail, where we have our prothonotary nest boxes. And another partner for us is James City County. And when we told them about the importance of these birds, they helped us make signage to go out there, so people every day walking on the trail can learn about that. Next slide. That's another banded bird, an American oyster catcher. You can actually read those big letters on there and turn that information into the researchers so they know where their birds went. Next slide. William and Mary has done a lot of work with bluebirds, and this is one of theirs with multiple bands out there at the Marina Garden as well. Next slide. And something else we can do, which is really important, is the way we mow and cut trees down. Maybe you can't tell from the slide as much, but the whole left side of this is real thick growth that just is full of sparrows and other birds. And it got mowed, but some of it you can see got mowed, but some of it got left. And that's one of the strategies that we can all use, whether it's a small yard or a big area. And you can mow and then still leave areas for wildlife to live. And then maybe 3 years from now, in this picture, the right side will be grown up and the left side then can be mowed and the birds can be in the other part. And you don't just clear cut everything so that wildlife has no place to go. And we've all seen how Northern Virginia and places like that have turned into so much concrete and roads and buildings that wildlife still needs some places to go, of course. Next slide. And that's at the same site, another example. You can leave some trees, you can leave some other patches, and then you can mow other areas. Because mowing has to get done. You can't just ignore that either. So. Next slide. And we can also donate money to, there's so many organizations out there that need help, and they do a lot of great work. So think about helping them that way. Next slide. And let's hope that all of our wildlife won't just be in museums, so that our kids and grandkids will have to go there to see things. This is up in Alaska too. And it's great. It's a great educational resource, but we don't want that to be the end point for all of our wildlife. Next slide. And I think most importantly, just get out there and do something. All right, thank you. If there are questions, comments, I think Judith said we had time for those.
Yeah, we are just a few minutes before 11, so let me check the chat box. Okay. So far,
I guess they can be comments as well as questions, people's own experiences and things like that.
Absolutely. So here's a question. Where do Caspian terns nest? And what is the difference between birds that nest on Craney versus the new spot, Fort Wool?
Oh, okay. Those are good questions. For Caspian terns, I know they nest around the Great Lakes. And there's even the occasional one, I think, that has nested in Virginia, but I think that's quite rare. And they're also, I think, out in northwestern United States, like in Oregon. I don't really know the entire range for that. And is the other question about how the nesting alternatives worked at the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel this year? Is that what it is?
I believe so. I'll read it again. What is the difference between the birds that nest on Craney versus the new spot, Fort Wool?
Oh yeah, it's really pretty interesting, and that's why it's great that we're studying all these things. Least terns nest at Craney, and they don't nest over at the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel or at the barges or on Fort Wool. And royal terns are on the barges by the thousands, and they were on the Bridge Tunnel. They don't nest over at Craney. And these are areas that you can see, they're probably only a couple of miles apart or something. So, and there's more examples like that too, but they have their different requirements for nesting, and they don't all do the same thing by any means. There are no black-necked stilts, for example, over at Fort Wool, but they're at Craney Island.
We have a question. Is it possible to get copies of the butterfly brochure?
Yes, they are in the warehouse in my closet in my spare bedroom. And I probably should have said that. Yeah, we should have a way to distribute them. There's actually two sets of brochures. Adrian and the Master Naturalists and Coastal Virginia Wildlife Observatory produced a local one, and those have been available at the Botanical Garden. And then we made these other new ones that are more for the whole coastal area, and we gave those to the schools. But both of them have different amounts of information in there, and they are available. And so probably the best thing would be is if they would tell you if they would like some, and then I can get them to you, and we can distribute them through some of your events. I could just give you some, and you could hand those out, or I don't know what the best way would be to do that, but we have lots of them.
Okay, and I know that on the Botanical Gardens website, we do have a place where we have the local butterfly brochure in a PDF form. So we'll figure some stuff out, and we'll figure out a way to do that.
Well, and there's a PDF for this one too, so people can look at it. It's just nice when you have it in your hand when you're out in the field, because then you can open it and see. Although I guess people can open them on their phones now too, right? And look at them like that. So that's, I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk about ways to get that information out. So.
Yeah, and I can certainly disperse that PDF file.
Yeah. Thanks for that question.
And another question. Just started a pollinator meadow this year. Mow or not to mow this year?
Well, and I wish there was an easy answer. you can go on a lot of different websites and get different information. Unfortunately, some of it's conflicting, and one thing might say mow it every 2 years, something might say mow it every 4 years, something might say cut the trees out. So without knowing more about the spot, it's kind of hard to say, but the idea is to manage it for wildlife and also not cut when they're nesting or when the butterflies are pollinating. There are times of year that are better and worse for doing that. So it'd be hard to answer that specific question for that site. But if they want to contact me directly, you can give out my email and I'll be glad to try to interact with them. So that's fine.
Okay, I will do that. I'm making a note of that. And just along that train of thought of that question, I know that it is a difficult and kind of a dicey question. Our pollinator meadow has had some issues because it was mowed at one point and apparently the timing was not correct. And we have a lot of invasive plants that have sprung up. So
Right.
it's you would think it would be easy, but it's a little more complicated than you think.
It is, and we all mow a lot of our small spots, but there are these huge organizations that mow that mow the highways and the shoulders and the medians and places like that. So there's a lot of work that's being done out there, but mostly it's just trying to keep wildlife in mind when you're doing that, as opposed to just mowing because you've got the time to do it. Then it's mindful. It's mindful mowing, I guess.
Next question. I've been reading your daily hawk watch reports, and it seems as if there was a huge number of blue jays. Is that usual?
That is so unusual. I've been actually going over to the shore to that same site at CHINCOTEAGUE there for close to 40 years. And there were a lot of days when there would be no blue jays. Some of the big days, there was maybe several hundred. And this year, our counter had several days of 8 to 10 to 12,000 in a day. And the season total is something like 80,000 or something. So it was just off the charts with the amount of blue jays. I then checked some sites from the Midwest and from the Northeast, and they mostly were not seeing those huge numbers. So it was a really interesting phenomenon that seemed to be coming right through our area. And that's why you have somebody counting at the same area, doing the same protocols for year after year, because you can then see these patterns. And it's just fascinating because you wouldn't have known that from Hawk Mountain or Duluth or someplace like that. But then here they come by here. So that was highly unusual and was a real treat for us. The other part of that, though, is while it's a treat for us, it may be because the food crops in Eastern Canada, the acorns and a lot of these other trees and cones and stuff, do poorly. And so the birds are coming down here to find food. So wonderful for birders, but we're also hoping that they're finding plenty of food down here, which they did, by the way. Our acorn crop around Williamsburg was outstanding this year. So it may well be that it wasn't good up there and they came down here and found plenty to eat. But yeah, that was spectacular this year.
If I can add something to that, I started taking the Master Gardener Tree Steward program. I wasn't able to finish it this year simply because I had too many plates spinning. But they were talking about how trees themselves go through various reproductive cycles, so that some years are great for lots and lots of acorns, and that impacts the wildlife populations. And so everything really is connected.
Sure is.
All right. Is the blue jay phenomenon, sorry about that, an eruption or a migration event?
Is it say that again? I'm sorry.
Is the blue jay phenomenon an eruption? And I don't It's
Yes.
or
Yes.
a migration event.
Well, it's actually both. It's migration, eruption, and just so people know, IRRUP, not ER, like a volcano erupting or something like that. Is a periodic thing that goes on, where the numbers just increase incredibly in 1 year. But like red-breasted nuthatches, there are lots of those around this year, and next fall it's very likely that there won't even be a single one, but the following fall there probably will be. So there are a lot of really bizarre cycles out there, and it is part of migration, but that's what eruption means.
All right. I'm not seeing any other chat questions. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Your annual report arrived the other day and really seemed to focus on the incredible efforts of previous volunteers, especially those who have passed. Thank you for highlighting their gifts to our community and to nature. So that's a lovely comment. And the annual report is available in a PDF on your website. I discovered that this morning when I was doing some screenshots. So, so anyone who wants to take a look at that annual report, just go to cvwo.org.
Well, actually, that has changed, and on your screen, it actually had it correct somewhere, but it's virginiawildliferesearch.org now. I think if you WO, it'll probably go there. If you Google Coastal Virginia Wildlife Observatory, it will go there. So I think that's fine, but we changed it a couple of years ago.
Okay, all right. So here's the thing, is that I thought I knew that, okay? And somewhere it does show, and it may be the link on your Facebook page that literally says cvwo.org. So yes.
So Shirley, who does a lot with our page, if you're listening, or I can talk to her anyway, I guess, that we had to update a lot of places once we changed it, and it's possible that it didn't get changed there.
And monitoring Facebook and yes, taking care of all those breadcrumbs of digital footprint is a challenge. I can attest to that.
I think it was supposed to be set up that if you went to the old one, it would take you to the new one. But
yes, it does. It absolutely does. Yeah. So, all right.
Let me mention a couple other examples of connections, because I meant to throw these out earlier, talking about how everything is connected. In Colombia, in South America, the government got rid of a lot of the drug cartel. And that was a wonderful thing because they were shipping drugs all around the world. And when they did that, a lot of farmers moved in to the areas where the cartels were, and they deforested something like 1 million acres of tropical forest. So here's this attempt to, rid the world of dangerous drugs. And the resulting connection that came out of that was just habitat loss all over the place, which is just such a paradox. And the other example is that the world has really been pulling up the middle class in a lot of developing nations. And that's great because people are coming out of poverty, but they're needing water, they're needing food, they're buying cars, which are polluting and all of that. So, all of these things work together in very complicated ways, but it's a lot of it's paradoxical.
All right. Anything else from anybody? Well, we have had a very attentive audience. And Brian, I thank you so much. And I do realize it certainly was, an all-encompassing concept.
Yeah, what a topic. Thanks for that.
And Shirley Devan just typed in vawildliferesearch.org is the website. And yes, I will include that correct link in the in our follow-up email. So, all right, I think that is it for everyone.
Thank you all for your interest.
It's a beautiful day out there, and so go enjoy nature.
And congratulations to all the work that the Botanical Garden does. and all the people that are helping with that. That's great.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.